pastor refused to bless a statue of the Virgin Mary, and 4 minutes later, a bolt of lightning struck him from a clear blue sky. The air, thick with the scent of summer ozone and scorched grass, crackled with a silence that was louder than the thunderclap that had preceded it. On the manicured lawn of the old parish, the white marble of the statue remained untouched, her serene face tilted toward the impossible cloudless expanse from which the fire had fallen. Pastor John Davies' world was built of straight lines and hard truths. His office at Grace Community Chapel, a modest brick building on the edge of the Tremont neighborhood in Cleveland, Ohio, was a testament to this fact. The books on his shelves were arranged not by subject, but by height, their spines forming a perfect, unwavering block. The pens on his desk lay parallel to the edge of the leather blotter. There was no clutter, no personal photographs, no sign of a life lived outside the rigid framework of scripture and sermon notes. The only movement was the slow dance of dust motes in the afternoon light slanting through the tall, plain glass windows, illuminating the sterile order he had cultivated. This order was his sanctuary, his defense against the chaos of a world that had betrayed him. His church, too, reflected this. The pews were polished but hard, the hymns were traditional but sung without passion, and the cross on the wall was bare wood, stripped of any ornamentation. He preached a God of law, of scripture, of unassailable logic. There was no room in his theology for the sentimental trappings of faith, for the weeping icons or the flowery petitions to saints. To him, they were distractions, spiritual detours for the weak-minded who could not face the stark, silent majesty of the Almighty alone. It was a cold faith, but it was sturdy. It was a fortress he had built stone by stone, and its walls were very high. He stood in his office looking out at the Cleveland skyline, at the distant silhouette of the terminal tower. The city hummed with a life he no longer felt a part of. He was a shepherd whose flock was a task, whose calling was a duty. The warmth, the easy compassion he saw in other clergy felt like a foreign language. His own heart was a locked room, and he had long ago thrown away the key. He preferred the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights in his study to the messy, unpredictable pulse of human connection. The world was broken, and his job was not to mend it with flimsy hope, but to describe the geometry of its fractures with unwavering precision. The locked room in his heart had a name: Maria, his wife. Her memory was not a soft, comforting glow, but a collection of sharp-edged facts. The diagnosis. The prognosis. The 6 months of grueling treatments at University Hospital's Cleveland Medical Center, a place of bleached white hallways and the constant low beep of machinery. He remembered the smell of antiseptic that clung to his clothes, a smell he could never quite wash out. Maria's faith had been the opposite of his. It was soft, intuitive, and full of grace. She kept a small, worn rosary with blue glass beads on her bedside table, its silver crucifix warm from the constant touch of her weakening fingers. He had prayed. He had stormed the gates of heaven with structured, logical, theological arguments for her survival. He had quoted scripture back to his God, demanding the fulfillment of promises. He had done everything right, everything his systematic faith required, and in return, he received only silence. The beeping of the heart monitor slowed, then flattened into a single, piercing tone that sliced through the sterile air of the hospital room. He had looked at the rosary still clutched in her hand, at the serene face of the Virgin on the small silver medal, and felt nothing but the cold, sharp sting of abandonment. It was not a crisis of faith. It was a confirmation. He had not lost his belief in God. He had lost his belief in a God who listened, who intervened, who cared for the small, sentimental pleas of the human heart. That part of his faith had died with Maria. He had packed away her things, including the little blue rosary, into a box he stored in the attic. He had replaced the soft comforts of her belief with the hard armor of his own. He would never again make the mistake of asking for a miracle. He would never again be vulnerable to the false hope offered by a plaster saint or a mother of God who had not saved his own Maria. The invitation had arrived a week prior, thick cardstock embossed with the seal of St. Michael the Archangel Church on Scranton Road. It was an ecumenical gesture, a request for local clergy to attend the dedication of a new garden and the blessing of a statue of the Virgin Mary carved from Italian marble. Davies had almost thrown it away. The very idea was an affront to his sensibilities, a monument to the kind of idolatry he preached against every Sunday. But duty, and the preservation of cordial appearances within the community, demanded he attend. He would go, stand silently, and leave as soon as was polite. He arrived at 4:10 p.m. under a brilliant, sun-drenched sky. A small crowd had gathered in the newly consecrated garden on the church grounds. The statue was beautiful, he had to admit. The marble was a luminous white, the lines of the Virgin's robes flowing with a grace that seemed almost liquid. Her hands were outstretched in a gesture of welcome, her face a study in serene compassion. An older woman with kind eyes, the parish council lead, approached him with a smile. She thanked him for coming, and then, in a moment of spontaneous goodwill, she asked if he, Pastor Davies, would honor them by offering a brief prayer of blessing. A hush fell over the small assembly. All eyes turned to him. This was the moment his private conviction met public expectation. He felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He looked from the woman's hopeful face to the statue's placid marble one. He saw not a symbol of grace, but a monument to the silence that had answered him in that hospital room. "We do not pray to idols," he said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the warm afternoon air like a shard of glass. "Our prayers are for God, and God alone." A gasp rippled through the crowd. The woman's smile faltered, her face clouding with confusion and hurt. Someone in the back dropped a set of car keys, the metallic clatter echoing in the sudden, thick silence. It was 4:12 p.m. Davies gave a curt, formal nod, turned his back on the statue, and began to walk away from the garden. He felt their stares on his back, a weight of disapproval he wore like a mantle. He had drawn his line. He had defended his truth. At 4:16 p.m., and with no warning, no cloud, no preceding rumble of thunder, the sky split open above him. The bolt of lightning was not a flicker, but a solid, blinding pillar of white-hot energy. It struck the ground less than 5 feet from where Pastor Davies stood, throwing him from his feet. The sound was a violent, physical crack that vibrated through the bones of everyone present. The smell of superheated air and burning earth filled the space between one heartbeat and the next. Then, silence. People screamed. Someone shouted to call 911. Through the rising chaos, the statue of the Virgin Mary stood, untouched, her marble gaze fixed on the empty blue sky. Paramedics from Metro Health Medical Center arrived in minutes, their sirens wailing down Scranton Road. They found Pastor Davies conscious but disoriented, with burns on his shoulder and leg and a strange, branching pattern of red lines across his back, like the limbs of a scorched tree. The crowd was a collection of stunned and whispering statues. Their eyes darted from the pastor being loaded onto a stretcher to the blackened circle on the grass, then to the pristine white figure in the garden. The event was too sudden, too specific to be dismissed. It felt like a response. Word spread through the Tremont neighborhood before the ambulance had even reached the hospital. In the afternoon heat, it traveled from front porches to corner stores, over phone lines and text messages. At Lucky's Cafe on Kenilworth Avenue, the story was passed between tables in hushed, speculative tones. A man who had been there described the cloudless sky, the pastor's hard words, the 4-minute gap, and the impossible bolt from the blue. Some called it a freak weather event. Others, shaking their heads slowly, called it something else. They spoke of signs and wonders, of a line being crossed. The city, for a moment, seemed to hold its breath, contemplating a mystery that defied easy explanation. The story of the pastor and the statue took on a life of its own, becoming a piece of local folklore before the sun had even set. John Davies lay in a room on the 5th floor of Metro Health Medical Center. The window looked out over the industrial flats, a landscape of smokestacks and freight lines under a hazy sky. A persistent tremor had taken root in his right hand, making the starchy white sheets tremble. The rhythmic, electronic beep of the heart monitor was a constant companion, measuring out his life in sterile, predictable intervals. Each beep was a reminder of the hospital room where Maria had died, a sound that had once meant life and then, in its absence, death. He was a prisoner of that sound, a prisoner of the body that had failed him, and of the memory that gave him no peace. The burns on his skin were a dull, constant ache, but they were nothing compared to the searing loop playing in his mind. The polite request, his own cold, clipped refusal, the turn, the 4 minutes of walking across the grass, the blinding, world-shattering crack of light. He, a man of logic and reason, had spent his life dismissing the supernatural, explaining away the unexplainable. Now, the unexplainable was written on his own skin in a pattern of scorched flesh. He tried to frame it as a meteorological anomaly, a positive streamer reaching up from the ground to meet a leader from a non-existent cloud. The words were hollow, a useless intellectual shield against an event that felt personal, targeted, and immediate. The fortress he had built was in ruins, and he was alone in the rubble. That night, sleep would not come. The hospital hummed with its usual nocturnal rhythms, the soft squeak of nurses' shoes, the distant chime of a call button, the low murmur from the television in the next room. Sometime after 2 a.m., a change began. The harsh, antiseptic smell of the room, a smell he knew so intimately, began to fade. In its place, a new scent bloomed in the sterile air. It was the rich, unmistakable fragrance of roses, so thick and real, he thought for a moment a visitor had left a massive bouquet. But there were no flowers. Then, the light in the room shifted. It was no longer the flat gray glow from the city lights outside, but a soft, luminous blue-white radiance that seemed to emanate from the corner of the room near the door. It did not cast sharp shadows. It simply filled the space with a profound and gentle light. As he watched, the relentless, rhythmic beep of the heart monitor next to his bed ceased. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, a palpable presence that settled over him, calming the tremor in his hand and soothing the ache in his skin. A night nurse, doing her rounds along the corridor, paused as she passed his door. She saw the soft blue light spilling from beneath it and heard the sudden, inexplicable silence from his monitor. She looked at her watch, confused, a small frown on her face before she continued on her way. Davies saw no figure, heard no voice. He simply lay in the light and the silence and the scent of roses, and felt the touch of a presence that offered no judgment, only a deep, abiding, and silent compassion. 2 weeks later, John Davies walked out of the hospital, leaning on a simple wooden cane. He did not go home. He did not go to his own church. He took a taxi to Scranton Road and asked the driver to stop a block away from St. Michael the Archangel. He paid the fare and walked the rest of the way, his steps slow and deliberate. The evening was cool, the sky a deepening twilight purple. The garden was empty. The circle of scorched grass was still there, a dark scar on the otherwise perfect lawn. He walked past it, his eyes fixed on the white marble statue. In the weeks since the incident, it had become something of a local shrine. Small bouquets of fresh flowers now lay at its base. A few handwritten notes were tucked among the stems. A string of familiar blue glass rosary beads was draped over one of the outstretched marble hands. Davies stood before it for a long time, the sounds of the city traffic seeming to fade into a respectful distance. He saw not an idol, not a distraction, but a symbol of the gentle, merciful faith his wife had tried to share with him. He saw the face of the mother he had accused of abandoning him. Slowly, painfully, he lowered himself onto the damp grass, his knees cracking in protest. The position of supplication felt alien to his body, to his pride. He did not speak. He had no words left. Instead, he reached out with his trembling right hand, the one that had been shaking since the strike. He reached past the flowers and the notes, and his fingers brushed against the cold, smooth marble of the statue's cheek. He saw a small smudge of dirt there, left by the rain. With a tenderness that surprised him, he wiped it away. It was a small gesture. It was everything. The quiet act in the garden did not go unnoticed. The older woman who had first invited him to speak saw him from the window of her small house across the street. She watched the proud, rigid pastor kneel, and she saw him wipe the statue's face. She did not feel vindication. She felt a wave of compassion and whispered a small prayer of thanks. The ripple of that simple, contrite gesture spread in ways he would never know. A week later, a teenager who had been at the dedication and had openly mocked the story was seen at Lincoln Park, quietly picking up trash and putting it in a bin, an act of service his mother had never seen him perform before. One of the paramedics who had treated Davies was driving his ambulance down West 14th Street on a non-emergency call. He passed the entrance to the garden at St. Michael's and saw the growing collection of flowers and candles at the statue's base. He remembered the pastor's scorched skin and the impossible blue of the sky that day. He slowed the vehicle, a strange sense of peace settling over him for just a moment. A quiet beat in the midst of the city's constant chaos, before the radio crackled and sent him on to the next crisis. Pastor Davies's sermons at Grace Community Chapel began to change. The rigid geometry of his theology softened, the hard lines of judgment replaced by the gentle curves of grace. He spoke less of God's law and more of God's love, with the quiet authority of a man who had been broken open and remade. He no longer spent his afternoons in the sterile order of his office. More often than not, he could be found sitting on a bench in the garden at St. Michael's, not praying or preaching, but simply being present, a quiet guardian of a place that had become sacred in the most unexpected way. One afternoon, a young woman, her face etched with a fresh and devastating grief, sat on the bench beside him. She saw the cane and the faint scars on his hand. She did not know who he was, only that he seemed to possess a stillness she craved. She told him about her husband, about an accident, about the hollowing silence in her home. He did not offer her scripture or platitudes. He simply listened, and when she was done, he told her his own story, about a woman named Maria, a blue glass rosary, and a hardness of heart that took a bolt of lightning to finally crack open. Sometimes grace does not arrive as a gentle spring rain, but as a bolt of lightning from a clear blue sky. It is not always a comfort. Sometimes it is a fire that burns away the fortress we have built around our hearts to leave us exposed, vulnerable, and ready, finally, to be healed. The greatest miracles are not those that defy the laws of nature, but those that defy the laws of a hardened human heart, making it soft again. If this story touched you, like the video, subscribe to and share it with someone who needs hope today. Tell us your moment of unexpected grace in the comments.